starting a couple of minutes late, but we'll get going just because of time and other sessions that will follow. Thanks, Martin, for that keynote. The timing will be pretty good, and there'll be some good segues. You're not stealing my thunder, but you're setting the stage. All right, so in this session, we're going to talk about meeting the new GC-Drupal initiative in the Government of Canada's digital design system. So about this session, we're going to cover off CDS, Canadian Digital Services, talk about the new GC design system, and talk about web components. We're going to talk about updates to Drupal Core, so Drupal 10.1 and 10.3, how it's impacting SDC and recipes. And we're going to demonstrate how that could be integrated throughout the flexibilities of all of the Drupal options, whether it's layout builder, CKEditor, paragraphs. We're going to look at all of those typical scenarios. What does this mean for wet-boew, WxT, GC Web, all the same thing. So evidently we're hanging on to a Bootstrap 3 world when it comes to GC, and that's evidently a predecessor to where this is going. And then we're going to talk about some API-1st Headless options and look at Next.js integrations as an example. So, quick intro about myself, managing partner at OpenPlus, hands-on solution architect, been working with GC for about 15 years, as well as other governments. Pretty involved in advocacy, working on committee roles even. Pretty good understanding of procurement and government, which is always an interesting, difficult subject at times. A good understanding of GC project cycles, IT policies, and everything that's needed to get projects achieved in GC. Big, strong believer in open source. It's in our logo, it's in our name, and big believers in value to Canadians and API-1st unlicensed solutions. Je suis francophone, so if anybody wants to babble to me in French, go right ahead. And last but not least, that's our shop dog, Kobe. About OpenPlus, so we're dedicated to only doing public sector projects, so pretty familiar with government standards. Everything we tend to do is multilingual, accessible, and deals with mobile responsive, and of course governance. We're experts on the enterprise side of Drupal. We don't do WordPress, don't really touch any other technologies, so Drupal, Solar, and API-1st initiatives is sort of our bread and butter. Websites, portals, intranets, collaborative apps, so a wide range of projects, which has impacted what we're going to show today, right? So sometimes we're doing certain projects that don't require content authors to be as involved, so there's a range there. And we do projects from A to Z, so from project management to UX, down to support and maintenance. We've been big code sponsors of initiatives in GC. We've been maintainers of Drupal WxT for a long time. And we've got some bulk scripted migration tools that we run through gccloud.ca. It's just an online endpoint so that we can harvest out content, agnostic of whatever is out there. We can pull from a variety of sources. And I think to date we have several 100,000 pages that have been bulk migrated from other platforms, other tools, and harvested and brought into Drupal WxT, meeting compliance, dealing with French toggles, and bringing things properly in as file IDs, TIDs, things of that nature. We also run a 24/7, 365 operation where we actually do hosting. So we have an outsourced operation, and I don't mean through a pantheon. I mean ourselves on cloud, Azure, PBMM for Protected B, and we actually host Canada.ca and some GC.ca sites ourselves. So today we're launching GC-Drupal.ca on the heels of Drupal 11 launching, if you will. And this is just an informational site that showcases a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, which is the GCDS design system. Some recent projects that have factored and influenced some of the decisions that we're making now. We've worked on Environment Canada's national intranet, recalls.canada.ca, which is an interesting application that's completely outsourced and hosted and maintained by us. We've done some work recently with the BC government on a metadata catalog application. which the front end is all used through Drupal. So there's no back end being used. People are oblivious to the fact that they're using the Drupal application. So it could involve multiple governments, multiple departments. Other projects you might have seen is tc.canada.ca, my TC, there's National Intranet, several other projects that revolved around TC, such as Transformation Data Information Hub. And right now we're working very closely with CRA as the lead architects to deal with bulk migration and architecting their new site. So let's talk a little bit about the status of our journey. I'm sort of going backwards because I wanted to hit a couple of important notes right out of the gates. So we started prototyping with the GC design system, which we'll talk about in a bit. And through that, we identified some key challenges of things we were going to have to deal with, and trying to investigate experiments and methodologies on how we were going to deal with some of these challenges. Because we're not only talking about web components, we're talking about custom HTML namespace of components, which can impact and change things a little bit. So we'll look at some of that. And Martin touched on a slide that I thought was pretty interesting, because we wanted to get a push out to Drupal.org on this base theme, but we did run out of time, and there is a process still to follow. We're not trying to build something and then throw it out as a release candidate. We're building something and then making sure that it gets released as an alpha to the community. But as you've seen through our profile page on Drupal.org, we're pretty involved on open source and contributing back. So we're hoping that 30 to 90 days or so, we'll be able to push the base theme of this. So this is sort of a preview of all of this. So maybe a show of hands here, who is familiar with GC design system or have heard about it? All right, good, quite a few people. So digital.canada.ca, Canadian Digital Services, has essentially built this new GC design system, aka GCDS. Which is an alpha. It's on GitHub, so people can go and participate and take a look at it and investigate it as much as you need. Now, this is not a session about GCDS. So I know there's people from CDS that are here. So they're in the house if you want to have a chat with them. There's a couple of them rowed out in the back there. So if you have questions about GCDS design system, you can go ahead and chat it up with them. I only have 45 minutes and I want to include a demo. So let's talk a little bit about some components 101, right? Because there are some variances that come into, if you're doing ground up web components and you're working from Storybook, you do components and you're in Drupal, that might be different from building common web components that are agnostic to any platform, such as has been the case with GCDS. So just to expose a bit of that, we've got 38 components that are currently in play with GCDS. And those aren't labels, those are actually the namespace of these custom HTML elements. So there's a couple of things that people need to wrap their heads around in what it means to work with A, components, and then B, what it means to work with custom HTML elements that impact that. So, for those of us that are used to the bootstrap worlds and traditional HTML markup, you see sort of a before and after, where traditionally this is what an H1 tag or an H2 tag might look like, and now it looks, as you see below, is the GCDS heading and a tag. So, and then the output of that through the JS that runs would probably look something like this, right? So you're dealing with slots and props, and so the markup in the ecosystem is a bit different. So out of those 38, wanted to just sort of share where there's areas of focus that we have to look at, maybe more in the Drupal community, and to try to focus on this as a CMS, right? So from a content management side, where do you need to sort of focus and be more familiar with things? So, GCDS, header, signature, search, or things that make up your overall wrapper theme, well, you're not too worried about that. That's going to be in a base theme, and that's going to do its sort of job. But if we focus on the content side of things, right, we got a GCDS heading, we look at what's going to be happening in the body that involves around components. So if we look at more content-oriented components, GCDS heading, evidently links, details, containers, text, buttons. So these are examples of what you'd probably be using more commonly in a WYSIWYG editor such as CKEditor 5. So one challenge that came out of the gate is that those aren't those aren't available in CKEditor 5 or CKEditor because the namespace doesn't exist, right? So if you have that content in a rich text editor, it'll be blank. It'll resolve on the back end, but it's a foreign body as it comes to a CKEditor side of things. So we had to devise a methodology on how we were going to deal with this, right? So GCDS headings, well, we know at the end of the day, that's sort of traditional H1, H2s, H3s, H4s. And we could use classes and a governance naming convention to deal with props and values for what we intend to do on the output of that. So we're going to show examples of that. Other patterns to be familiar with, GCDS alerts, cards, right? So all of this sort of funnels into the reusable and nested components, where cards is a good example of one because that's sort of the final output, impacting links, impacting buttons, things of that nature, but then a card or an alert is a good example of what you see. The GCDS grid system is essentially just a CSS grid, right? So there's no Bootstrap 3 or any of that that came from Wet that exists in any of this. And the balance of a lot of these components are primarily forms. So let's talk about pros and challenges. Notice I didn't use pros and cons, so specifically using the term challenges. Everyone's always up for a challenge. So there's some big pros that come with this model. It addresses more schema level decisions, which you sort of get automatically working from components, right? So we get the props and the fields and the intent that a designer might have had. So if they've worked at an atom level on Storybook, at least they can give us a control pattern and expectation on what they expect to see and what they want to see, as opposed to letting site builders have to figure out the intent and how we would have otherwise architected it. So it largely takes care of the HTML markup and the CSS for us, right? So that's going to help with improved consistency and improved compliance. Custom HTML elements helps with keeping lanes segregated, right? So less collisions, and it more cleanly potentially segregates away from GCDS. So if you've got a bunch of markup, well, you might not be getting into collisions because your divs and classes, it keeps the namespaces segregated. And of course, that'll get better and better as more and more patterns come out, right? We're going to see probably hero banners, things of that nature. So components that are more content oriented. Hence why I was sort of picking at alerts and cards as a good example. Now the challenges that come with that, and I've touched about this one before, is that now we're having to deal with the implications of what does custom HTML elements and how do you deal with that? And remarkably, there's very little information on this in a lot of the communities. We know how to deal with some of that in CK5 and how to register custom HTML elements. But overall, we wanted to see on how we could integrate this throughout the Drupal ecosystem. And for almost any platform, there are limitations on where and how you just tell it to use your own custom markup, right? Because it could be a cross-site scripting risk, and there's limitations on saying, no, you're only allowed to use this HTML throughout the platform. We already talked about GCDS as an example. It's a foreign body as far as platforms are aware. So the other thing is web components, they can overwhelm people a little bit, right? So for something like a card or an alert, you might have 5 or 6 or even 10 options or fields to fill out. So if you're used to working through a flow of a WYSIWYG editor, now you've got inputs and inputs and inputs and inputs, and then it can start to stack up, and you're really sometimes getting a poor rendition of what you see is what you get is sometimes sort of out the window. So we're trying to factor a lot of that, but again, it's the flexibility of what are all the options that we can consider. So let's park GC Web, the GC design system for a minute, and let's talk a little bit about Drupal modernization. So good segue to a lot of what Martin was bringing up. And also to touch on, well, Drupal WxT, right? It's been around for a long time. And it's surprising still to us that people confuse in government that have been lifers, if you will, that WxT they sometimes associate to Drupal WxT. WxT, wet-boew, GC Web, it's all the same core library that's in the end Bootstrap 3 and jQuery. Evidently, that's running its shelf life. But now we've got an opportunity to modernize with some of that. And the timing is rather good because Core is making really good decisions for us and we get to align with it better. So step one, evidently we wanted to do a base theme. We didn't want to carry any luggage wherever we could, so I'm sort of coining this ACAP model of as core as possible to come out of the gates. We started off starter kit, and we wanted to support sub-themes, right? So for which is basically new out of Drupal 10. We wanted to integrate GCDS web components, and of course for us now it's SDC. So single directory component was a great timing for us to work with components. We didn't have to worry about, do we go UI patterns, which method we use. So the fact that it ended up as SDC, it made this a decision for us. The other part of this is, people are may be familiar with Drupal WxT as a distribution or running it as a theme only. And again, Martin talked about the pros and cons of sometimes being tied to an install profile or a distribution, right? And there are pros and cons. And back then, that's all we had to go with. So now we've got the benefit of looking at leveraging recipes, which again is, I believe, in Core only as a 10.3. So it's right on our heels, right? So we're just playing with this now. And that'll allow us to focus more on feature type deployments, right? So whether you just want to share a blog feature or whether you want to do an install profile or combine all of these things. Think of it a little bit like SDC, where you can run composer recipes that are just for the modules, just for your feature, configurations just for your feature, and deploy sample content just for your feature, right? So it allows you to share content that way. That said, once a recipe runs, it evaporates, it's gone after. So that's the contrast to a distribution, right? So as you run your recipes, it can help you out of the gates, ensure and do some checks for you. But again, there's things there to be aware of what recipes does and doesn't do. And then looking at Experience Builder. So again, Martin talked a little bit about that. And that's a bit in flux. So a couple of people had some great questions that, we've been in the same boat for a while now, where do we use Layout Builder? Do we not use it? What we expose to front end? Do we do paragraphs? Do we not do what the CK5 do? So the answer is sort of all of the above. So we tried to look at this through the lens of flexibility and to not make decisions for anyone, right? So step one for us is a base theme that'll have components, and that'll allow people to hit the ground running. But we're going to showcase some examples of that. So the base theme on this is pretty straightforward because it's governed and displayed to us, and here are the libraries that are available and that we're told to use. So if you go to digital.kinda.ca and you look at the GC design system, they'll show you, here's how you can do some install scripts. So we've incorporated this from starter kit as a base to say here are essentially our CDN calls to JS and CSS files. A couple of things we're working on right now after having conversations with a few people in government. So a big pro and a con is, there's the ability to always be tied to the @latest in that URL string. Again, that's a big pro and a big con. Do you want to automatically inherit a bunch of things that change, especially at the JS level, where components change on you and you don't know about it? That could be a bit tricky. So, yes, so we're going to be looking at trying to pin down those versions right on the theme, and potentially even bringing the libraries online in the system in the event that someone needs to be air-gapped or doesn't want to do CDN calls. It's always nice to have that potential opportunity. So if we look on the left here, we've got our GCDS components, which is just a single directory, YAML file, twig, quick readme that points back to GCDS. Pretty straightforward. So if we look at the context of things, and in this scenario, we would be having a sub-theme, let's say, that we wanted to do the details and summary, and we had an FAQ module. Well, it's easy to sort of use Twig to pattern on how we would want to do this, right? So you're going to have some scenarios, such as maybe a recalls.kinda.ca, where you're not really using an editor. You're not really using rich text. Things are very fielded, controlled, very patterned around field sets. So it's pretty easy to map components to your fielded entities, and you just use Twig to figure that out. So if we look at what Twig might look like in GCDS namespace, if you will, we're showing two scenarios. So on that FAQ that we just showed, on the bottom on the right, you're seeing the straight up direct call from the GCDS components, GCDS details, and that markup in your Twig template would work, and that, we actually started with it that way. That one's commented out. It's sort of hard to tell, but the bottom one's commented out. And the top one, instead of letting the JS unpack that component, if you will, we're calling the component directly from the theme, right? So the syntax is a little bit similar as far as what we want for an output, but now you're relying on the component in your theme. So if you're running a sub-theme and you want to run your own derivative, or if you want to do other experiments, you could be calling your component directly, just in your subtheme or on the core base theme, or just flat out use GCDS details and let it run right off the JS. So a couple of examples on, or just to talk as sort of a topology of sort of what's going on. You've got CDS that's working closely with Figma with their design system, and they use Storybook, and from that they also work at getting components, and there's a CDN, CSS, and JS that they feed out through a CDN that's versioned. We sort of talked through some of that. Then meanwhile, you've got your Drupal site, typical. And then there's the ecosystem that goes with all of that, right? So how this exists on drupalcode.org, and where and how this is going to live. But you know, that's where we're at. This is typically sort of the model. All right, demo. So I didn't want to, of course, do a demo off of a live Wi-Fi, so I did pre-record, and I've got a lot of things to go through, so pre-recording was best. So step one, even at the login screen, the user interface you're seeing right now are all components, right? So when you click on a field and it highlights, like these are actually the fielded GCDS components that we've tied into the web forms directly. So even on the barcodes that I'm going to share at the end, we've got a few of us that have a barcode at the end and there's barcodes at the back. If you scan that, you'll actually get to this web form. And the web form was built with no code. It's the Drupal web form module, but we've twigged the GCDS components into a couple of the common field elements, checkbox, input text areas. So if we look at how that might otherwise look, right? We just typical test module, and even the alert at the top is a GCDS component. So as you run through and you submit that from the button to the details to the alert, those are all sort of components that are running in play. To show some variances on the base theme settings, right? So there's a couple of modes you might want to run a site like this on, right? So step one, you might be deploying a site that's a public site. So it's a CMS site. You have to use the theme mega menu from the Government of Canada, and that's incorporated as a component, right? So in the footer or in the drop-down menu, you get to make some decisions. So we didn't want to do too much in the theme settings, but as you'll see here, I'm running two themes. One is just a sub-theme of our demo environment. And at the bottom here, you can actually select, okay, I'm going to run the GCDS mega menu, or I'm going to run the default Drupal main menu, or even turn off a menu, right? And same for search. You can either turn it off, point it to canada.ca, or point it to your own site. And as you do that update, you'll see now I've got my top nav navigational component that's driving into this. And if we look at how that integrates, and again, we tried to use the default menu system that comes with Drupal, hence the main reference. But then you're back to traditional Drupal, right? So creating a menu link, whatever link you need to do, and just to show the nested components. So you see GC-Drupal there. We take the first menu and we throw it in the slot so that it appears on the right? So there's some twig capabilities there that fall into that, but you can see that the first menu got added to the right, and then whenever I give it children, it automatically falls into the GCDS component to deal with showing children. We went as far as to then show the sidebar menu, so there's a sidebar menu component, so we tried to show that and incorporate that in the demo. So the next piece here to talk about, if you look at this page, we've got the GCDS heading, and you'll see we've got buttons, we've got cards. Notice when I'm on the back end, I don't see any of that, right? Because again, we've got that custom namespace. So if you're looking at this through markup, through an editor, it's back to what we were talking about earlier, right? So this markup is basically a foreign element. CKEditor won't know what to deal with it. So again, you can either declare it and try to tell it what the intent of some of these things are. But as we mentioned, there's approaches that we're taking for filters to do that. Now, in a contrast, if we look at an FAQ environment that's more of a fielded, guided template, well, we don't really have to worry about any of that, right? So if you have the base theme, you're not worried about CKEditor or filters, then you can just deploy it and twig against it like that, and that's about the extent of it, right? So again, we're trying not to overbake anything so that if you're using it in these contexts, all the components are still there and available, and you can run it that way. So you'll see here, all we did is activate a view mode, and then we twigged around the view mode to just do the GCDS card. So here we get a preview of the card, but if I go back to the landing page, there's a twig for the GCDS grid and the cards. So if we look at the filters and the approaches that we're trying to look for using CKEditor 5 filters and processors, if we look at headings, links, and how we handle some of that, when we're in CK, we're essentially still going to work with conventional HTML markup. So we're going to show that here in a second. But we've got a sample page that shows, scenarios. So we've got details, headings, buttons that would be as styles, right? Not so much buttons for forms in this context. But if we look at the markup here, this all came out of CKEditor 5, the markup matches the intent, right? So we're showing GCDS details, GCDS headings, we're filling out the props as needed. Is it an external link? So all of that gets passed through on the end output once we're done. So as you can see here, we're filling out slots where needed, and a lot of that markup in CSS comes from the component. We don't have to worry about a lot of that kind of stuff. So once you wrap your head around some of this stuff, it can be really beneficial. You don't have to worry about some of the granularity of it. So here what we're doing is just seeing, well, how can we integrate some of this in Drupal WxT? We want to use conventional HTML, and we want to use classes. And through doing that process, no different than the styles dropdown, we just have link styles. So all we do is apply a class that matches prop names and outputs, and we set headings the way we normally would. Same goes for buttons. So if we expand a button, we wanted to use evidently the Drupal link system, but apply some variables. This is just a module that allows us to do styles on buttons, community module, of course. And then the output of that is like we said, so it represents it as a proper GCDS code markup that then the JS picks up and unpacks the web component. We did extend a few things to try to make the back end represent the front end, as we try to do most of the time, so that CKEditor is seeing the CSS and the overrides that come with a lot of this. And we went as far as to grabbing the CSS that came from some of these components and exposing them to the front end. Right? So we see here I've just got details, summary, and then there are classes that you can append to it that then get picked up on the component output, which are just test filters. CKEditor 5 text filters. So a couple of modules that we enabled on this just to help, which again, in the base theme you wouldn't have, but if you want to run a couple of these modules, there's the CL SDC module that exposes all the components. This basically just automatically reads out what's in your component directory. Right? So if you have a YAML file that explains all the variables and options that are in your component, it'll just give you a front-end representation of that. So it's CL develop, which is just component library. So it'll expose a lot of that just to the user as a front end. The other module we were looking around with SDC display from the team at Lullabot, which is very new, it's very green, but if you're not looking to work with Twig, you can use this SDC display. Again, it reads out your components in your components directory, and when you're in manage display, you can pick the potential component that you want, and then you just map the props over to the fields that you have. And of course, they have to correlate, right? If it's expecting a string, you can't just give it a list, things of that nature. So there's a little bit of trickery to figure that out, but we've two biggest examples that we've worked through on this is URLs, where they're not just string. We don't just do absolute URLs in Drupal, and same for images. We use either media library and or we use Drupal's link system. But at the end of the day, we've got to find a way to extract just the path of the image and strip out any HTML that we may not want out of a link and pass that to the component. So we were able to figure out some of those components, some of those twig elements just to make that one. So if we look at a card, now I'm on a paragraph type, and on a card for a paragraph, I can do the same thing. So whether you want to use Twig or you want to use SDC display, whether it's for a block for a card, or whether it's for a paragraph with sorry, a paragraph to a card or a block to an alert. Those are just the examples. So one of the approaches that we took here is evidently you can have localized paragraphs, and then you're in the gauntlet below of just adding paragraph, adding paragraph, adding paragraph, and away you go. For this demo, what we opted to see is how we can still incorporate this within CK5, because a lot of our clients still sometimes use long files, and they don't want to necessarily interrupt the flow of that file. So we just use the two embed modules, the paragraph embed, so that they can author paragraphs right from here. So you see that I can tell it, okay, well, let's use a 2-column or 3-column. Let's use a background, and here you're just populating what otherwise might be a banner. So there's no CDS banner yet, but we know it's probably coming and around the corner. So we were just showing an example on how a component can help you potentially build a paragraph. So if we look at it more from a cards perspective, with a GCDS card, so in this example, which we're going to fast forward, because again, it can take time to populate all of these things. But if you tell it, I want a 3-column card, you've got to fill out all the variables that the component expects of us for each card. And after you've created all of your 3 cards, then in CK, you typically just get your object field that wraps it around that. So if you double click it, you can see here that you've got your cards, you can resort them, edit them, and these are all mapped to components. So once you save this, then you'll see the paragraphs created the cards for us, and the component matches the markup. But again, we're not pre-baking any of these things. Those are just add-ons and constructs that you get to choose whether you want to do. Here we're looking at the block embed module. Similar approach. You can either create and author a block from here that's reusable, or you grab a existing block that you want to put on several pages. You could, of course, call it through Layout Builder. So we're showing the ability to create cards through paragraphs that are unique to this page, and a reusable element as a block that gets added as a block. So we haven't done any magic to CKEditor 5 on this. They're just the embed modules that come, and it's traditional. The only thing we've done is map or twig to the components. So now if we look at Layout Builder, well, the same thing can sort of apply. So we wanted to, again, support as many variables here as possible. So we've got some layout API updates that we're trying to do in the bottom, that we're showing how you can just add a layout that comes from a GCDS predefined layout. We enabled the library templates just to show how you can sort of speed up that task, right? Because it's something that's been echoed to us by clients where, ironically, using AEM, a lot of it is fielded components, and it gets tasking and it gets overwhelming. So we wanted to see what we can do with templates to try to help that out. So with one-click action here, you can sort of predefine that it's going to add a section and it's going to add 3 blocks. So I threw all of those in there in one shot. Easier to do that, and then go in and maybe modify and append some of that. Right, so on the side here, I could change out an image, retitle my card, whatever we would want to do, but it's sort of a better experience if you have your users using Layout Builder, right? So again, we're trying to show the diversity of being as agnostic as we can in Drupal, which in and itself is hard. You know, Experience Builder is a big piece of that. The other thing we're adding at the bottom here is just to use a Layout Builder. We're just going to throw an FAQ view on the bottom of this as a block, just to show the context of how you could incorporate components in different ways. So we've sort of shown the ability to do cards on a node with paragraph. We've showed the ability to do cards and alerts through Layout Builder, and then we've showed how views and view modes is still able to use cards and meet that compliance. So these are all nodes that got filled in through review. Okay, next step. So other embedded elements that we were looking at, there's the embed module that we had been looking into, which we've got samples of that on another server, so we didn't have many options to show here. But this could be a GCDS button, for example, right? So there's other options there that exist. What I wanted to show is an additional option here, which is just CKEditor 5 templates, right? So content templates, which really is just HTML that you've predefined as starting templates. So interesting and left, we have a banner on top. This is just another way of bringing in a starter pack of saying, hey, bring in the details in this banner width that we want to kick off with, and then you can manipulate it from there. You're back to all of the other segues that I've introduced from a bit earlier. So it's a good approach of showing how you can work in CK, still get a representation of it, still have components. Which one is best? It's almost content type by content type, client by client, scenario on how we're going to be able to use some of these things. But we even have the ability, we're showing how you can work with the padding system, so you can override. If you don't want a margin bottom 400 by default, you can override and say I want it to be a 200 by just using CK padding 200. And an important takeaway here is that we work a lot of times with content authors. So some of our clients have like 300 plus content authors that don't get to have a source HTML and don't get to do any HTML. So we have to govern a lot of how they do content using governance. We're just showing here the template configuration. So in CKEditor 5, just showing how the banner gets generated. So you can keep all your morsels, if you will, in there. And then from CK, you can pull them in as you go. They can be a whole page, they can be just pieces, and you can nest them where needed. Mind you, these aren't directly components. If something updates in your template, it won't be recursive and apply throughout your build. So let's talk about WxT for a minute. So I've moved and switched over to a server that's got a default Drupal WxT base install. And we're trying to see how we can incorporate the two, right? How can they coexist? So step one was exposing the GCDS, CDN libraries and JS into Drupal WxT. So if you've got a Drupal build, there's a way to essentially just call in the libraries. And you can see that in this Bootstrap 3 Drupal wet environment, we've got GCDS alerts. And they're rendering, okay, a couple of variables that are applying. I don't have the full width because there's a set container. And the only collision we saw was basically on the H1 where we've got the double red component. We think we know why that's happening, but that's sort of an easy fix. Now notice on the exact same server, I've switched over, and now I'm actually running the exact polar opposite. I'm running the GCDS theme first and calling in the wet libraries. So that creates an interesting dynamic of how you might stage progressive adaptation of migration over time, right? You can even have sections porting over as you will. So similar, you'll see the top header, the H1 is clear now. We've got the full width, but all of the wet-boew markup is still there. And again, there's no real collisions there, shy of the ones we pointed out, because the namespace is very separated. So just showing here that we've got the wet bootstrap and GCDS all in one environment. So last piece to the demo, we're going to talk a little bit about decoupling and Next.js. So if we look at the defaults, we used a Chapter 3 Next Drupal approach for this with Next.js, which is React-based. So we've got 3 articles that are default content types in Drupal. And you guys saw how we architected this, right? So cards, CKEditor, so if you focus on the whole body of everything in CKEditor and how we architected all the content, we're going to show how that transposes itself into a Next.js decoupled solution. So we've got a repository, which is just a traditional npx install. And then from that, all we did is took the Next.js templates that came from Chapter 3, and we run this, and we wrote in and did an import using the React approach to the components, right? So we're theming completely differently now. We're not using WebComponents. We're now using the React approach. And you can see it looks very similar, but it's sort of deceiving because now I'm in a completely different world. But I've got consistency on the look. And really I've just relied on components, but I've used components completely differently. So here the whole wrapper is done in Next.js calling those components, but I'm relying on Drupal's API to call in views, teasers, and a whole body of a node, right? So here we're just showing the index page. where really all we're relying on this page to do is have our header text and have some overrides. And on the bottom there, you see we've got an API call that basically just calls a view. So it's just going to give me all of the teasers that are coming out of the view module. And then we do the same for patterning on the templates for the actual. So see, we're showing the view mode or the article teaser. We could have not templated it through here and just passed over the markup already, but we wanted to show that capability where if you want to do your templating using React components, you could still do it this way and call APIs or known entities that way. Again, so this is the teaser, the view mode, no different than I was sort of showing for the cards earlier. And then on the article, we're just kicking off the overall wrapper of the article and the body, but the whole body that you're getting just comes from the bottom. So with this one call, we're exposing all of the authoring that we did on the Drupal site. So Drupal is going to expose that to that node. So all of the markup and all of the content can get published from the Drupal side, and then it could be in any, and this is just traditional Next.Drupal, Next.js, that decouple frameworks that you might want to look at. There are some modules that you configure also if you want to do progressive decoupling, where you only want segments of your site. So let's say you either have a events portal or a complicated search app, and you only want certain aspects of your Drupal site to be in a completely separated React or a Next.js application, then you could do that this way, right? So you set up your preview server, and here you bind it to the content type architecture. So in this case, we're going to do articles, but you could have it just so that your FAQs could be external to a Next.js application as an example. So just showing some of the front end, sort of the back end configurations that go with that. So now, whenever we crack open an article after we've done this, it'll always sit and load the preview in line now. So it's sort of funny because it looks like Drupal within Drupal, but now it's the Next.js only for that content type to doing it this way. And you see the body rendering. And at the top, if you click on that, you do get a tokenized preview that's private, it's not published. But again, you see the node. All of this was, content body was done through Drupal, but the balance wrapper is Next.js. Okay, so takeaways. So GC Wet, GC Web, wet-boew, as we talked about, they're sort of all the same thing. And we showed that with GCDS, they can coexist, right? It's going to be a marathon, not a sprint, to deal with some transitioning over time. And we're looking at leveraging all of the Drupal ecosystems with respect to leveraging some Drupal reporting, some tagging, some workflows to help transition over time. So whether you're doing it by content type, imagine that you've got a lot of content. There's a cost of change that you've got to factor as well. So it's going to take a transition period to deal with that. I've got a next slide that's going to talk a little bit about portals and CRMs and how we leverage the API, but it's pretty interesting that we've got components in Drupal. So now if we start working with APIs more, which we tend to do more and more, if you've got to integrate with other platforms, it introduces some great opportunities. Headless, Next.js, Vue.js, React, Angular, we don't otherwise care. Run what you run. We know that in the Drupal community, some people have their flavors that they prefer. Doesn't really matter at the end of the day. APIs are prevalent, and granularity with content architecture in Drupal allows us to do so much. I think we've shown that in some of these demos. So be fully aware of the risks of decoupling, right? So you can start chasing some of these things over time. If you've got a simple sub-site and/or you've got a really strong front-end team, and multiple developers, so if you lose one, you're not stuck to some of these components, or if you just want to do progressive decoupling, there are some pros and cons that come with that. So just make sure that you're aware of what you lose out if you choose to bypass Drupal and only rely on its API. Things like path alias, URL alias, where if the URL changes, it'll keep resolving the page. These are little examples that sometimes people take for granted. But when you step away from Drupal and only rely on the API, it can cause a few issues. Quick comment, biggest risk to your project is probably a bit of procurement. So we like to make a reference to it. We are on all of the typical Government of Canada vehicles, but we prefer that that people try to insist on using solution-based approaches so that it's not just staff augmentation, right? So focus on deliverables, allow a team that knows the whole ecosystem to be involved on a whole project. It sort of evolves and steps away from arrived CAN models. We've got a session at 1 o'clock that's going to be around AI and looking at 4 or 5 capabilities and models and options on how we would integrate that, and we're using the same base system that we just showed. So it's sort of interesting because we're thinking GC, we're looking at components, and we're looking at AI and how we integrate all of that back into this. So again, if you scan that QR code, you're seeing the GCDS web form, and you can always populate it out. If you've got feedback, you want to be notified on either training or updates that are going to come from it. And if you want to ask questions that maybe you don't want to ask here, go ahead and fill out that form, and we'll get back to you. Right, I don't know where we're at on time, but we're pretty close. Questions?
So, I've never worked with the GC design system before, but I've worked with other design systems. You had that slide near the top about pros and challenges. And now, bigger than any of the challenges you listed, in my experience, one of the biggest challenges is long-term maintenance. And since you're at like an alpha stage, I think you've got an opportunity here to try and make some good decisions that are going to mitigate that and hopefully not make it worse. There's a few things in here that worry me a little bit that are going to contribute to long-term maintenance problems. Like, for example, having complicated markup in WxT, or what happens when that markup goes to change. Are there other ways that you've thought about long-term maintenance and how to make that smoother, easier?
So overall there, the concerns are just talking about web components, maintainability, and the luggage that can come with that overall, right? So in a way, we sort of have a luxury from where we stand, where we don't have to worry about that. That's handled for us by government. So a lot of the questions you've brought up are good questions, but they need to really be asked and posed to government, right? So no different than in Wet3, they decided to use their own custom grid system, and then they realized, well, why don't we just use Bootstrap back to, oh, it's a Wet 3.1 and align with it, right? Those were sort of decisions that were made back then. I'll circle back to kittens from Martin's example, right? We use sometimes free as in beer, not free as in kittens. Well, free kittens, it takes work, and right, free in beer is fun. Well, there's a difference, right? So you're taking on potential responsibility, work, and effort that comes with any custom code that you do. The good part is with CDS, they take care of a lot of that. So we don't really need to worry about any of that side of things. And on the same token, the way we look at it is we don't really get those choices. We don't get those decisions. We're here really only to look at what can we do in Drupal to honor and work with that, right? So WxT and wet-boew, that was given to us. This is how it works. These are the technologies. This is how it's going to function. Same for web components. Same for the fact that we're using custom HTML namespaces. So we've got to work with them to try to figure out those pieces. But the onus doesn't fall then on the departments or the agencies or potentially even us as vendors or resources. We can rely on them to do the maintenance and update of that. I think pinning down the @latest and dropping and controlling versions was a big piece of that, to understand that you don't want to inherit a bunch of things that change on you, right? There could be some risks that come with that. So originally, we didn't really think too much about that, but through broader discussions, that was a piece that said, no, let's pin down version 6.22 of these components, and your site's operational, so that you're not always chasing these things. It's almost the opposite of a scenario to what you mentioned, because it can be happening externally and happening quickly, and things are changing faster than you want, and then you're stuck inheriting those things if you don't control them. So you can see the benefits of pinning down some of these things. David?
Simple question. You did highlight some CSS collision at some point between GC Web and GC Design System. Have you noticed any JavaScript collision as well between the two frameworks?
If we've, did you mention collision?
Collision, yes.
The only other collisions we sort of saw was some typefaces and like the wet labels were a little bit bigger. So there was like literally only 2 or 3 things that we saw that we had collisions. So we even looked into why is there a double red underline, and we noticed that some of the CSS wasn't just applying to the GCDS heading, it was actually looking at the H1 directly. Maybe those are things that you guys are already familiar with or aware of, so we might inherit that fixed downstream. But shy of the GCDS heading, and maybe some typography in a couple of areas, as you may know, with WxT, you guys were sort of relying on Bootstrap and whatever was happening there, right? So people were coming across some Bootstrap things and applying them, and they would work, right, in GC-WxT. So we tried to print out to pages what are all of the things that people use to author content, right? Here's how tables look, here's how panels look, here's how the old details look. But you'll notice in that screen, like the old method of handling details still works, and it didn't collide with the GCDS details. So, you know, we've got to give kudos there that they're segregated and they can live in separate worlds.
Awesome.
Last question at the back.
Hey, thanks. Great presentation, and kudos to OpenPlus for the work that you've done. What's going on in my mind, maybe because I don't really understand, is this an approach, or is this the recommended approach from the perspective of CDS? You know, as a developer here who does stuff
Right.
from time to time needs to plug it in to Canada.ca. Is this something we as developers should be adopting, or is it something that is interesting but still another approach?
I'll definitely invite you guys to have a cross conversation. That's great that they're here, and you guys, I'm not shifting that off to them. But it's similar to the question that we had at the beginning, right? Where I don't want to say that this is a mandate yet. They're still in alpha, but clearly they're modernizing the front-end frameworks, right? They know that wet is based on Bootstrap 3, and you know they're modernizing, right? And as far as will CDS mandate this, we don't know some of those answers. We're just trying to show a methodology on how it would be adopted, right? So using the base theme, we're trying to minimize so that we don't over-bake things and make decisions for you. But we know we're probably going to end up with components. We know that this will probably be the modernized markup for how the site should otherwise work. How you integrate it downstream, paragraphs, layout builders, things of that nature in CKEditor, you'll still have the capabilities of making decisions there as developers and as vendors. I think that was my last question. Thanks, everyone.